My name is Melissa. I'm 29 years old, and for 4 years, my own parents told our entire church congregation that I was sitting in a prison cell, not struggling somewhere, not estranged, in prison. They said I'd gotten involved with drugs, that I'd been arrested for theft, that I was a cautionary tale they used in prayer circles to warn other parents about what happens when a child goes down the wrong path. The truth is, I was on a military base in Texas, then later stationed overseas, serving my country, while the people who raised me stood in front of 200 people every Sunday and turned my absence into a lie they found easier to live with than the truth. I found out by accident, the way you find out most of the worst things in life. Let me start from the beginning, though, because none of this makes sense without understanding what my relationship with my parents actually looked like before I left. I grew up in a small town where the church wasn't just a building you visited on Sundays, it was basically the center of everything. My father was a deacon, my mother ran the women's ministry. Our whole social life, our whole identity as a family, revolved around that congregation. And in a world like that, appearances matter in a way that's hard to explain if you didn't grow up inside it. What people think of your family isn't just gossip, it's currency, it's status, it's proof in some twisted way that you're doing something right with your life. I was always a bit of a disappointment to that image, though not for any real reason. I didn't want the life my parents had planned for me. They wanted me to go to the small Christian college 2 towns over, marry someone from the congregation, settle down close to home. I wanted something else. I wanted to see what existed outside the boundaries of that town, and when I turned 18, I enlisted in the Army. My parents were furious. Not worried, not scared for my safety in the normal way parents get scared, but furious, like I had personally embarrassed them in front of God and everyone they knew. My mother told me joining the military was not what good Christian girls do. My father barely spoke to me the week before I left for basic training. There was no big send-off, no prayer circle, nothing like what I'd seen other families do for their kids leaving for the service. I left for basic training with a small duffel bag and a hollow feeling in my chest that I told myself would fade with time. It never really did. For the first year, we still talked occasionally. Short phone calls, stiff and awkward, more updates than conversations. Then slowly, the calls got shorter and less frequent, until eventually they stopped almost completely. I told myself it was just distance, just difficulty adjusting, the normal strain of a daughter being thousands of miles away. I had no idea what was actually happening back home. I served 4 years total. Basic training, then stationed in Texas for almost 2 years, then a deployment overseas for the last stretch of my service. It wasn't easy. There were things I saw and did during that time that changed me in ways I'm still working through, honestly, even now. But I was proud of it. I was proud of who I became, of the discipline, of the version of myself that existed outside my parents' shadow for the first time in my life. When my service ended, I came home with an honorable discharge, full benefits, a clean record, everything you'd want walking out of 4 years in uniform. I thought foolishly, maybe, that coming home with that kind of record would finally be something my parents could be proud of, even if they hadn't wanted this path for me in the first place. I drove straight from the airport to their house, discharge papers still in my bag, half expecting some kind of quiet reconciliation. What I got instead was my mother opening the door, staring at me like she'd seen a ghost, and saying, "What are you doing here?" I didn't understand the question at first. I told her I was home, that my service was finished, that I wanted to see them. She looked past me toward the driveway like she was checking if anyone else was watching, then quickly pulled me inside and shut the door like she was hiding something. My father came into the room a moment later, and the look on his face wasn't relief or joy, it was something closer to panic. It took almost 20 minutes of confused, circling conversation before I understood what was actually going on. My father finally just said it, flat and cold. "People think you're in prison, Melissa." I laughed at first because it sounded so absurd I genuinely thought he was joking. He wasn't. Over the 4 years I'd been gone, as my calls home became less frequent, my parents had built an entire narrative around my absence for the church community. According to them, I had fallen into a bad crowd right after high school, gotten involved with drugs, eventually been arrested for theft, and was serving time. They told this story so many times to so many people in so much detail that it had become the accepted truth in a community of over 200 people who had known me since I was a baby. I sat in their living room and just stared at them, waiting for some explanation that would make this make sense, and there wasn't one. My mother eventually admitted that when I enlisted, she felt so humiliated by what people would think, a daughter joining the military instead of following the path they'd laid out, that she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth. She said something vague at first, that I'd moved away and wasn't really in the picture anymore, and when people pressed for details, the story just kept growing, layer by layer, lie by lie, until prison became easier to explain than the truth ever was. I asked her how joining the army was somehow more shameful to her than telling people her daughter was a convicted criminal. She didn't have an answer for that. Not really. I think the honest answer, the one she could never say out loud, is that in her mind, my joining the military was a rejection of everything she'd raised me to be, and my being in prison, as horrible as that sounds, was at least a story that fit inside the world she understood. A story about a lost sheep. A story where she could still be the sympathetic, suffering mother instead of the woman whose daughter chose a life outside of her control. I left their house that night without really knowing what I was going to do with what I'd just learned. I drove around for hours, replaying every awkward interaction I'd had with people from my old town over the years. Every time someone had looked at me strangely at the grocery store, every time an old classmate seemed to avoid eye contact. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. I decided I wasn't going to just quietly let this story keep existing. Not because I needed validation from people I hadn't spoken to in years, but because somewhere in that congregation were people I actually did care about, people who'd known me as a kid, people who deserved to know the truth instead of a lie my parents had built to protect their own image. I called the church directly and asked to speak with Pastor Whitfield, who had been the pastor there since before I was born, someone who had actually baptized me as a baby. I explained who I was, and there was a long, heavy silence on the phone before he said, quietly, "Melissa, I've been praying for you for years." I told him I was fine. Better than fine, actually. I told him I had just finished 4 years of honorable service in the United States Army, and that I had never once been arrested, never touched drugs, never done anything even remotely close to what he had apparently been told for years. I told him I had my discharge paperwork in my hands right now if he wanted proof. He asked me, carefully, if I would be willing to come to the church that Sunday. Not to make a scene, he said, but because he felt the congregation deserved the truth, and because he felt, given how long this had gone on, it needed to come from an actual place of authority, not just word of mouth that could get twisted all over again. I agreed. I drove to that church that Sunday with my discharge papers and a manila folder, wearing the same modest dress I used to wear to service as a teenager, and I sat in the back pew watching my parents' faces when they saw me walk in. My mother's face went white. My father wouldn't even look at me. Pastor Whitfield didn't make it dramatic. He simply said, near the end of the service, that there was something important the congregation needed to hear, something that had gone uncorrected for far too long. He called me up to the front, and I stood there in front of 200 people who had spent years believing I was a criminal, and I handed him my discharge papers. He read them aloud, every line. My name, my rank, my dates of service. The words honorable discharge printed clearly across the page. He read my commendations, too, the ones I'd almost forgotten I'd earned. Because after years of being told your own family is ashamed of you, you start to forget you ever did anything worth being proud of. The room was completely silent. I watched people's faces shift from confusion to shock to, in some cases, anger, though not directed at me. I saw an old Sunday school teacher of mine start crying in the third row. I saw my mother sitting perfectly still, staring at her hands in her lap, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Pastor Whitfield didn't shame my parents publicly, though he easily could have. Instead, he simply said that this community had been operating under a false story for years, that Melissa deserved an apology, and that the congregation deserved better honesty from its members going forward. He thanked me for my service. Actually thanked me, in front of everyone, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like the truth about who I was finally existed in the open instead of buried under someone else's shame. My parents and I didn't speak for almost a year after that. When we finally did, it wasn't some big emotional reconciliation. It was quiet, careful, both of us aware of how much damage had actually been done. My mother eventually told me, in a small, broken sort of way, that she didn't know how to undo 4 years of lying without admitting how deeply her own pride had cost her a relationship with me. I told her that was something she was going to have to sit with because I couldn't fix that shame for her. I could only tell the truth and let people decide what to do with it. I still go to that church sometimes when I visit home, not because I need anything from that community, but because Pastor Whitfield reached out to me personally over the years since then, checking in, treating me like the person I actually am instead of the story someone else built about me. A few months after that Sunday, he told me something I still think about. He said he'd had a small nagging feeling for years that something about my story never quite added up, the details shifting slightly every time my parents told it, but he never had a reason strong enough to question 2 respected members of his congregation until I called him myself. Sometimes the truth doesn't come out because someone goes looking for it. Sometimes it comes out because you finally decide you're done letting someone else's shame write your story for you.